much. Hello and welcome to today's webinar that's being hosted by the UNESCO Chair in Food, Biodiversity and Sustainability Studies. We're very glad to welcome you. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis and Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We recognize, honor and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and water on which Laurier and the Balsillie School as the home for the UNESCO Chair is now present. All of us working as part of the UNESCO Chair in Food, Biodiversity and Sustainability Studies at Laurier and the Balsillie School are grateful for our panelists' participation in this World Food Day webinar, and also for all the time that you took preparing for today and the experiences that you're going to be sharing with us that bring us all together. We also thank everyone in our audience for joining us. There will be some time at the end for your questions, so you can log these in the chat bar as we go. And we ask you to please turn off your audio and video so that we have as much bandwidth as possible for our panelists. I'd also like to recognize our organizers, Amanda DiBattista and Heather Reed, and thank them for making all of this possible. As we know, COVID-19 has exposed many pre-existing challenges and inequities in our food system that have disproportionately impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color community members and migrant agricultural workers across Canada. In this webinar, food system experts and advocates will discuss how people experience food system inequities and explore the impact of COVID-19 on their work. They will also suggest how we can work together to create a food system that is more equitable, responsive, and just. In the interest of time, because we've got lots of interesting things to talk about, I'm going to now present the panelists and then turn it over to them to begin the conversation. We're honored to welcome Melana Roberts, federal and municipal food policy expert and food justice advocate based in Toronto, Canada. She is also chair of Food Secure Canada, a pan-Canadian alliance of farmers, academics, Indigenous peoples, nonprofits, and food systems practitioners who work to advance food sovereignty through federal policy advocacy. Melana is also a member of the Toronto Food Policy Council, the Black Food Sovereignty Alliance, and a 2021 Action Canada Policy Fellow exploring equity, diversity, and inclusion issues in Canadian agriculture. We are also pleased to welcome Stephanie Morningstar from the Oneida Nation, who is an herbalist, soil and seed steward, scholar, student, and earth worker dedicated to decolonizing and liberating minds, hearts, and land, one plant, person, ecosystem, and non-human being at a time. Stephanie is the executive director and resources, relationships, and reciprocity co-director of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. She grows medicine and food for her community at Sky World Apothecary Farm and teaches QTBIPOC about the wonders of plant medicine and seed, soil plus spirit at the Seeds and Soil plus Spirit School. Stephanie carries with her over a decade of community-driven systems change work in the healthcare, legal, and academic research spaces where she cut her teeth on speaking truth to power. Her work advancing sovereignty in healthcare, child welfare, and legal systems with and for Indigenous communities has resulted in mandating Indigenous cultural safety trainings to serve as providers, Indigenous dispute transformation frameworks, and meaningful and ethical Indigenous-driven research in climate change. We're also very pleased to welcome Gabrielle El Aludua, who is a former migrant farm worker from St. Lucia and now an organizer with the collective Justice for Migrant Workers, and he will give us more information about his background as part of his presentation. Janet McLaughlin, we also welcome you as an associate professor of community health and a research associate with the International Migration Research Center at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has been researching health and human rights issues among migrant agricultural workers for over 15 years. With Jenna Hennebree, she is co-founder and coordinator of the Migrant Worker Health Project and the Migrant Worker Health Expert Working Group. Thanks to you all for sharing your knowledge with us, and I now invite all of our panelists, beginning with Melana, to tell us about your work and how food systems are important to you.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks to everyone who's joined together today for this important conversation. I'm so excited to hear from my fellow panelists. So I'd really like to start off kind of broadly talking about my work, because you heard I work at a federal, municipal, and community-based level. And I think all of that work has really been grounded in food justice principles. And so food justice is really the core understanding that communities need to exercise their right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. And I think what's important about this is that it recognizes that there's no one-size-all-fits solution for everyone. There needs to be a community voice and agency in determining what food systems look like locally. It recognizes the importance of empowering people, and it also recognizes the inherent right of access to good food. And so with that understanding, my work has really focused on democratizing food systems, place-based access and community building, and really economic development and revitalization of through regenerative practice and community knowledge in local spaces. And so working with Food Secure Canada, I've had the pleasure of working with a variety of people, as you heard, Indigenous peoples, community leaders, policymakers, practitioners, to really advance re-interlocking goals that are working to achieve food sovereignty. And for us, it's been, particularly in the last couple of years, really important to think about how we do this work in a way that actually starts to shift the systems that are reproducing inequities for people who are disproportionately impacted by food policy decisions and don't always get to sit at the table. And so we have started to do some of this really important work through doing kind of our core functions of capacity building, networking, and a federal policy advocacy. We've recently released a report called Growing Resilience and Equity, trying to provide clear action plans to improve food security and food systems work in the context of COVID-19. And particularly in this moment, as we tackle challenges of racial injustice, and we really see COVID-19 bringing to light a lot of the disparity and inequity within the food system, I think this is a moment where we're really working to hold a dialogue about what kinds of shifts need to happen and how we can do things differently. And so we're really holding questions about and trying to honor practices of how to value diverse knowledge systems, cultivating diversity in the work, and particularly diversity in the leadership of Canada's food movement, and really honoring the traditions and the practices that are informed by local systems to provide a unified and collective but unique vision of what Canada's food system can look like. And I think this is particularly important because Canada has recently come forward with its first ever food policy. And so this is a moment for us to really seize a window of opportunity to rethink what the food system looks like, who is a part of it, who's at the decision-making table, and what practices and processes we're honoring and following through with. Similarly, I work with the Toronto Food Policy Council, which is one of the oldest food policy councils in the world, and we bring together diverse actors across the food system, folks who are working in food service, emergency food programs, in restaurants, in programming with Indigenous communities, people who are contributing across the sector to bring these diverse lenses to come up with solutions to tackle local food challenges. And I think this is particularly important because this takes everyday citizens who are working in the food system to actually empowering them with the agency to shape food policy decisions that govern our lives. I think that this is everything from making decisions about where food grows, where different programs are located that support food access and knowledge sharing, where student nutrition programs are located. So really starting to democratize how decisions are being made. And I think this is a real opportunity in our food system, particularly to think about how we can center or shift the conversation of how these processes are enacted. The last thing I'll maybe speak about is my work with the Black Food Sovereignty Alliance. Now, this is an alliance that's been based here in Toronto under the leadership of African Food Basket, a longstanding community-based organization supporting African, Caribbean, and Black communities here in the city of Toronto, working with several individuals, community leaders, and organizations to come together to really think about what food sovereignty could look like to address the various barriers facing the Black community. For those who aren't familiar, food sovereignty, and particularly Black food sovereignty, is looking to confront systemic barriers that make food, place, economic opportunities inaccessible for Black communities and work to disenfranchise them on a regular basis. And I think this is probably some of the most meaningful work I have the privilege of supporting, because it's really thinking about how do we start to connect all of these different interconnecting areas across the food system to improve people's lives in a meaningful way. And what does it look like to start to understand not only the barriers and challenges of these lived experiences, but actually the resilience that these communities are demonstrating in working against the systems that are clearly not in their interests. And so I think this is a moment where we're seeing, an anti-racist lens being brought to the food system, asking really tough questions and centering different voices to have targeted initiatives that honor the experiences of Black communities. And I think we can see the significance of that when we likely will hear about more of Indigenous food sovereignty work and the importance of bringing forward voices that are often underrepresented for meaningful change. And just maybe the last thing I'll note, that I think these different interconnected pieces of work at the federal, municipal, and in the community-based level are critical when we're having conversations about sustainability and biodiversity. Because more than ever, we're seeing the traditional practices of land stewardship and of knowledge being erased of these racialized groups, and their contributions invisibilized in our food system. And more than ever, as we see the impacts of climate change, these are the same populations who are most impacted, the first on the front lines, and whose practices have been silenced and pushed aside and ignored. And so this is a real moment for us to see the interconnections between these things and recognize that there is knowledge to be shared, there's knowledge to be honored, and how can we bring those practices to build a food system with solutions that actually look at people who have been excluded and raise the floor for everyone. And just the last thing I'll note, that earlier, about 2 years ago, Food Secure Canada did a research study looking and speaking with people who identified as being food insecure to ask questions about how they made decisions about what they eat, and whether they considered sustainability in their eating decisions and where their food came from. And across the board, we heard from low-income people that they were aware of where their food came from. They understood the importance of purchasing locally and the impact on their environment, but they didn't have the financial means to do so. So I raised this to identify that it's not really about teaching people. People hold this knowledge. It's about creating the agency and empowerment to start to connect our different social and economic challenges, environmental challenges, to think about solutions. And so I'm really excited to continue this conversation to think about how we can connect all of the work that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melana. That is an excellent beginning to the panel discussion, and very much appreciated. Stephanie, if you would like to take it from here, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Sego, Sewego. I have some slides prepared here, and I'm hoping that you can see them okay. Does everything look fine to you?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here, and thank you. Thank you for those really encouraging, and it feels like we have a lot to talk about. So my name is Stephanie Morningstar. I'm Oneida Turtle Clan. I'm the executive director of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, which serves the northeast part of the United States. But as we know, that especially for Indigenous peoples, the border is arbitrary and really doesn't hold much meaning. So just bringing that forward in the work, and that honoring that this is World Food Day, a lot of these problems don't really, the imaginary border between these two countries makes no difference. It's the same on both sides of the border. Maybe a little bit of the jurisdiction and legalities around the language are different, but certainly the systemic issues are very, very familiar to all of us. So I want to share a bit about the work that I do at BIPOC and Land Trust, and why we do what we do. So we talk a lot about the word resilience, right? And I think that we've actually started building this concept that we just need to become more and more resilient. And there's only so much resilience we can handle before we snap. So what I'm trying to figure out is like, how can we stop bending so much to the point of snapping, and how can we bend the system and actually get to the root causes of these issues so that we don't have to continue to take on additional stressors on top of additional stressors. We deserve to have health, wealth, and joy in our lives, not just always struggle. So this is really why the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust started. So getting into it, this is a map of the territories that we serve. And you can see that this is an overlay from nativeland.ca of all of the traditional Indigenous territories that make up what is known as the Northeast. And this is our service area. It doesn't have any of the state or federal boundaries on it, but just to show you kind of what we're looking at, and what we're dealing with is something that's very common, which is that we serve unceded territory. We serve territory that is actually not ceded or treated in any way. So it's truly stolen land. And what we're doing as a land trust is we're identifying that 98% of, at least in the States, 98% of the farmland is actually owned by white folks, and nearly 100% of that farmland is owned by white folks in the Northeast. This is not an accident of history, and I'm not going to go through the whole history lesson right now, but we all understand what land as possession does, and the Northeast is even more unique in the way that the treaties there's no treaties. So folks have basically settled this land, occupied this land, and cut us off from our health, wealth, and joy and our traditional foodways. So just a little FYI around NEFOC Land Trust, we were initially incubated by Soulfire Farm, and we just left that incubation period. We're now into full fiscal independence and are starting to advance land access for Black, Indigenous, POC, farmers and land stewards in the Northeast. One of the reasons we're doing this is because our numbers are so low in these areas of who are farmers and who are workers on the land, right? So we end up becoming, we're like 1.5%. This is just a very small selection of some of the farmers of color in just Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, but this is across the board. Not only are we very low in numbers as far as who can access farming, you need a lot of things, you need resources to be a farmer, you need to have access to wealth, you have to have access to land, you have to have access to infrastructure. We have a historical relationship with the USDA that has denied us all of those things. And, there's been an exponential amount of land loss, not only for Indigenous people, but for Black folks who, received land and then had land revoked through 40 acres and a mule that was taken away, for example. Land peaked for Black folks in the States around 1920 and has decreased about 98% since then. So just a great deal of land loss and for BIPOC folks in general. And then if you count in whose hands are on the land and who's processing the food versus who are the farm owners, and you'll see that there is an exponentially disproportionate lack of representation of BIPOC folks in leadership in these ways. So our work is to advance land sovereignty in the Northeast region of the US through permanent and secure land tenure for Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and Asian farmers and land stewards who will work with the land in a sacred manner that honors our ancestors' dreams for sustainable agriculture, human habitat, ceremony, native ecosystem restoration, and cultural preservation. It's really, really specific to, it's a holistic approach of what we're trying to do. So we're not just looking at one issue, we're looking at the whole lifeway of being global Indigenous lifeways and how we can resituate ourselves in those lifeways, because we know that those are what bring that internal resilience and bring us the health that we need to continue moving forward and to really even out those disproportionate disproportionate social determinants of health. So ultimately the Land Trust is basically just trying to link farmers of color, Black, Indigenous, POC, land stewards to land, which is just disproportionately unavailable to us. The access for land for us is just, it's really unfortunately been historically taken. So we're really focused on trying to figure out how we can do this on unceded territory. And one of the ways we're doing that is by instituting something called an Indigenous Consultation and Partnerships Protocol. And that's because of the unceded territory I was mentioning before. So what we're basically doing is recognizing that this is unceded territory and that we don't want to replicate the colonial harm of land theft that has been perpetuated on in the Northeast since contact. So we're taking every moment, every opportunity we can to build relationships with the Indigenous communities of the Northeast, including my own people, the Haudenosaunee, introducing ourselves, building relationships, trying to build solidarity networks so that we can really start not only healing from the disparities of land and food access, but also to heal the wedges that have been driven between our communities, which is really that lateral violence and that colonial project really becoming, making itself manifest without ever having to lift a finger. We're doing it to ourselves. So a big part of the work that we're doing is actually healing relationships between our communities in ways that build resilience. One example would be our BIPOC farmers COVID-19 Skillshare series that came up just recently when COVID hit, and all of our farmers were really unfortunately affected, not only by shifting markets and all the things that you needed to do to ensure that you could still deliver your food, but additionally because of the comorbidities that farmers of color have and people of color have because of ethno-stress and lack of access to fresh food, living in food apartheid hot zones. We just have many more comorbidities that compound the effects of something like COVID-19, which we can see has disproportionately affected people of color and hospitalized us much more. So trying to advance things and build ways for us to respond to that system has been really important. So mainly, just trying to think if there's any other slides. So this is just one example of a way that we're building some resilience in the food system. And this is an ecosystem partnership that we've created with the Soulfire Farm, Black Farmer Fund, the Farm School New York City, and Corbin Hill Food Project. And this is specific to building an ecosystem of Black farmer co-op, marketing co-op, and training and access to land, basically creating an overlapping Venn diagram of support for Black farmers in New York State. So we're helping with advancing land access, we're helping with them connect them to the education and training that they need through Soulfire and Farm School New York City, and we're working with the Black Farmer Fund in Corbin Hill to advance access to land, capital and markets that they need in order to build basically community food hubs that serve not only our direct communities, but also create communal wealth building within our communities. And we're also we're working very steadily on supporting the land back movement and trying to do what we can for the land back movement as a land trust. I mean, we do work within the colonial borders of the law in that way, but we are starting to work with some Indigenous communities to receive rematriated land and hold it in trust while they decide what they want to do with it. So just being that pass-through mechanism to be able to hold land in perpetuity for different Indigenous nations that don't want to really maybe set up their own land trust or 501c3. So I am looking forward to more discussion about what we're here for today. Thanks so much for looking at my brief presentation, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm going to take over passing the mic for a moment, just because Alison's internet is a little bit wobbly. So thank you very much. I think maybe we'll pass it on to Gabrielle.
Thank you. Warmest greetings to everyone. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, my name is Gabriel. I'm a former migrant farm worker. Today, I want to tell you that on Monday was Thanksgiving in Canada. Today is the 16th of October, and today is World Food Day. Very important date, right? But I hope you'll raise your eyebrows if I tell you, by being a migrant farm worker in Canada, I discovered that I'm many things. Would you believe me if I tell you, I discovered I'm a God, I'm an angel, I'm a half human, I'm a slave, I'm a lab rat. But one thing I can tell you I am not a messenger to water down or sugarcoat anything. I want to tell you that the food that you eat, once a migrant farm worker is involved in the production of those fruits and vegetables in Canada, that there are 20 injustices. I keep asking myself that question, why that leaf in the flag of Canada is not green? In school, they taught us that the green is the natural factory where our food is being synthesized, but why is it red in Canada? That's a constant reminder for me. In my country, why red means danger. That red leaf is a constant reminder for me of the injustices that migrant farm workers face in Canada. On this day, I'm really grateful and thankful for this opportunity to highlight those injustices that migrant farm workers face in Canada. Today is the 16th of October, World Food Day. There's seven simple things I would like to tell you. That the food that you eat, the vegetables that you eat, it can be the safest form of our medicine. It can also be the slowest form of our poison. I also want to tell you that the Canadian food system, in Canada, food is not a basic human right. Food is a commodity, and that is not based on equality and fairness. I want to tell you that in Canada, it is legal. It is legal to exploit the soil. It is legal to exploit the environment, and it is legal to exploit migrant workers. I want to tell you today that the program, the Canadian Farm Program, as a former migrant farm worker, I'm telling you, is both an act, A-R-T, and acts, A-C-T-S, both an act and acts of cruelty against migrant farm workers. Today, I want to tell you that that program is designed and it is driven to dehumanize and exploit people, as so many other programs Canada consistently have over the years. Today, I want to tell you that being a migrant farm worker in Canada, we are denied equality. We are denied equality by being denied basic human rights, by being denied basic labor standards. Today, I want to tell you that the Canadian Farm Program, it's using over 100 years, Canada continues to use unjust immigration laws, unjust labor laws to work in tandem to keep migrant workers vulnerable and precarious. I want to tell you, I'm from the group. It's a political collective. It's called Justice for Migrant Workers. Who is that group really? Basically, we are all volunteers with a wide range of skills. What do we want? And I'm being really loud about it. What do we want? We want a Canadian food system that is healthy, that is sustainable, but also that is just. How do we do our work? Or what do? We educate people, we empower, we inspire, we advocate. We organize, we pressure politicians, and also we push people to action. Madam Moderator, please teach me how to push people into action today, to do that virtually. How do we do our work? Basically, three layers of our work. One, we connect with migrant workers. We connect with our allies. Two, we educate the public locally, nationally, internationally. And number three, ultimately, what do we want? We want to pressure the politicians to change those unjust immigration and labor laws. Today, I want to tell you that an MP from a political party in Canada told me three things. Well, at the conference, the person said three things, and that is the task I have. Let me see if I can repeat what the person said. The program that brought me to Canada, that brings most farm workers to Canada, it is so complicated. It is extremely difficult to understand. It is so complicated that it is impossible to navigate. It is so complicated that it is impossible to get justice. And that's Canada. Let me see if how simple I can make that. I want to tell you that the Canadian food system, how I see it as a migrant worker, it is built on race and it has fear built in it. Let me see the easiest way I can explain that to you, right? It is presented to you, the Canadian food system is presented to you as buy local. And it is nicely packaged, because when you buy local, you think of freshness, you think of good health, you think of nutrition, right? But what is in that? When you open that bag, what is in that? Canada is saying to those sending countries, send me people of color, people of black, people of color, send me people of color, send me people who are illiterate or English is a second language. Send me those people who are ignorant about human rights and labor issues. These are the three things Canada wants from sending countries. People of color, people who are ignorant or English is a second language. And preferably those people, if they're illiterate and if they're ignorant about labor issues and human rights issues. These are the people that Canada wants. But what does Canada do? What does Canada do? Canada would welcome us in a climate of fear to keep us compliant. Canada would welcome us in a climate of fear. And that climate of fear, it will take me some time to explain it to you. What does Canada do? Canada exploits us by keeping us both ignorant and poor because they pay us minimum and it's below minimum wage. They make us dependent. What does Canada do? Canada welcomes us in a country. What Canada is known for? A country for culture of silence. What does Canada do? Canada makes the program so complicated that it makes us invisible. And all of that is happening with the full blessing of government. The program is legal, it is not illegal. Who are the politicians loyal to? You, the worker, me, the voter, or you, the donor? And these are the challenges that we are fighting in Canada. So what is the challenge that we have? The perpetual threat of deportation. There's always that threat of deportation because we do not have status in Canada, and the constant prospect of not being able to provide for our families because unemployment is so high back home. These two work together and coerce us to work under difficult, dangerous conditions in Canada. I want to tell you quickly, because of time, who is a migrant worker in Canada, and that is enshrined in Canadian law. One, we cannot vote. I have a big mouth, they won't listen to me. I cannot vote. There's no power in my hands. I cannot vote. Number two, we cannot participate in culture and community. Does that make me human, more of a human, or less of a human? We cannot participate in family life. Can you imagine that? Your best day in Canada, family day, is our worst day, migrant workers' worst day in Canada. Can you believe? And that's enshrined in Canadian law. And Canada stands on the world stage as a champion for human rights. Can you imagine that? Canada, in being a migrant worker in Canada, can you imagine that? We are denied the right to be protected by ordinary labor standards. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being a migrant worker in Canada? It means we are denied the right to access adequate and comprehensive healthcare. Can you imagine that in Canada? In a nutshell, who is a migrant worker in Canada? In a nutshell, being a migrant worker in Canada means that we are denied equality. We are denied basic labor standards. We are denied basic human rights. In other words, being a migrant worker in Canada simply means that we are half human. In other words, we are slaves in Canada. I want to tell you quickly that the program that brought me to Canada is like a tree. I hope that looks like a tree. And the program that brought me to Canada is also like a telephone. It's a telephone number. Let me take number 54 in that telephone number. To be a migrant worker in Canada, the program that brought me to Canada, it is, am I putting it right? 54, is that how you say it? 54. The program that brought me to Canada, this year is 54 years. It's like a tree. And that program started in 1966. In a few things about that program, one, it started in 1966. So this year is 54 years. Number two, it's a government gift to farmers. That program is a gift by the government to the farmers. Number three, it is a hidden form of farm subsidy. It's a hidden form of farm subsidy. Number four, that program is a recipe for the exploitation of migrant workers. Number five, what is that program in a nutshell? It is having both immigration, unjust immigration laws, unjust labor laws working in tandem to keep us vulnerable and precarious. It is a program that have us trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and social ills. Let me go to the telephone again and take that number 3 from the telephone number. That number 3 is like the tree. There's 3 simple parts of the tree. We come to Canada because of the stem of that tree. And what is the stem of that tree? To do jobs Canadians do not want to do. And what are the jobs Canadians do not want to do? All the D jobs, the dirty, the dangerous, the difficult jobs. And can you imagine for 1 minute? The conditions associated with a non-unionized job. All of these jobs are non-unionized. Can you imagine the life of a migrant worker in Canada? Non-unionized work. The second pillar of that program, the branches. We are here to do all those dirty jobs, but we cannot apply for status. And in Canada, what does status mean? Status is a two-edged sword. Status to us is like Tylenol. Status to us is like Advil. Status to us is a painkiller. It would kill most of our injustices that we face in Canada. If we have status, it takes care of both our immigration and our labor injustices of vulnerabilities. If we have status, our immigration status is not questionable. Our labor rights, we are able to have an open work permit, which puts the pressure on our employees and not on the worker. So imagine we're here to do those dirty jobs, we cannot apply for status, and the leaves. We are tied to our employer by way of a tied work permit. Let me go over that. To be tied to your employer, to do the dirty work, and do not have the same rights as a Canadian worker. Let me go over that. To be tied to your employer, to do the dirty work, and you're denied basic human rights and basic labor standards. That's the program. That is the program. Let me tell you a few simple things. Let me go to the telephone number. Number 20 in my telephone number. I represents the 20, these are the things I call the 20 injustices. These are the things I call the 20 dark sides of Canada. And because of time, I cannot go into all of them. But what I'm happy to tell you, I can focus on at least one of it, housing. And what about our housing? A few simple things about our housing. One, we live on the farms. We do not live in society. We're not integrated in society. We live on the farm. Number two, we are the properties of the farmers. We are property. Number three, those houses that we live in, it is overcrowded. It is isolated. It is below standard, and or it's not regulated. This is our housing. All of these conditions there in our housing, they're ideal conditions for COVID-19 to spread like wildfire. Because of time, I cannot go into detail, but I'm really happy to tell you at this point in time that my esteemed friend, my colleague, my mentor, Dr. Janet, will tell you how COVID-19 have impacted and continues to both impact and expose migrant workers in Canada. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel. Janet, over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. And thanks, Gabriel. You're always a very tough act to follow. And I always learn something new listening to you. I've been very fortunate to have gotten to know many migrant workers like Gabriel over the past 15 years as I've been researching health and human rights, basically since my doctoral research on the topic. Throughout this time, I've been very interested in understanding the origins of the local food that I eat and I enjoy, as Gabriel mentioned. And through this, I learned of some of the very difficult conditions facing agricultural workers in my own backyard. And learning about this as a Canadian, it really forces you to look in the mirror and realize how much ignorance we have about the realities of our food production system. And so much of what I learned shocked and saddened me. Over the course of my research, I discovered that many migrant workers suffer from health issues, whether that be due to workplace injuries or the mental anguish of being separated from their families year after year, not to mention the risks of COVID, which we'll talk about in the next question. My work has examined the risks that these workers face on the job and the barriers that they experience to accessing healthcare, rights, protections, and workers' compensation. All too often, workers are not adequately protected from health and safety risks, which are very significant in agriculture. It's one of the most dangerous industries in the country. As Gabriel explained, migrant workers do not have the right to freely change employers, and they must normally rely on employer mediation to access services and supports. Given the power imbalance, the issues that Gabriel talked about of workers needing this job to support their families and the fact that they have no job security, many of them simply do not feel comfortable reporting problems or abuses when they arise. No matter how many years they have worked here, contributing to taxes and the agricultural economy, they do not have the right to gain permanent residency. So they are effectively permanently temporary. They are considered good enough to work, but not good enough to stay. And let's be very clear, the roots of this exclusion lie in racism. That's very clearly documented in the archival records as the government first debated this program in the 1960s, and very little has changed since then. Now, when workers do require healthcare or compensation, they have difficulty accessing these supports due to the structural constraints of migrant worker programs. Sick and injured workers are normally quickly repatriated to their countries of origin, and they're just replaced with others like an ongoing conveyor belt. In this way, migrant workers are treated as disposable or interchangeable. In fact, their presence is largely invisible and unknown to most Canadians, despite the fact that they have been a vital part of our agricultural system for over half a century. So I know that we're short on time, so I'll leave my first answer there, but in the next answer, I'll get more into the effects of COVID-19 on migrant workers.
Thank you so much, Janet. I really appreciate your comments as well as the comments of all of our panelists, and they raise really important issues that hopefully we can start to address now as we get into the two questions that you wanted us to put to you. I think what we're going to do in the interest of time is collapse them, if that's okay. So the first question, and we'll go in the same order as we've just had for our introductory points, is the first question is, how has the COVID pandemic changed the way that you think about the food systems and impacted the focus of your work? So the first question is about COVID. And then the second question is more visionary and looking forward, and addressing that question that has come up a lot about the culture of silence and agency and empowerment, really, and what we can do to make a food system that is more equitable, fair, and just. So Melana, if you would not mind taking those questions up, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks to everyone for a great response to the first question. So I'll just get right into it in the interest of time. To be honest, I don't think that COVID-19 has actually changed my personal perspective on the issues facing our food system, and particularly the inequity and injustice that's experienced. I think, if anything, what it has done is it's armed me personally in my work with a tool that's actually shone a light to highlight what many of us, anti-poverty activists, food security activists, people working with folks who are often most impacted by inequities in the food system have always known. So impacts of inequity are disproportionately felt. Here in Canada, Black households experience food insecurity at 3.5 times the rate of white households. 28.4% of Black households are food insecure compared to 10% of white households. We see very similar high numbers with Indigenous communities, with other communities of color, and as well with immigrants here in Canada. So we see a disproportionalized, a racialized experience of food insecurity in this country, much like experiences in the States and in many other countries. And I think it's important to note, when you're looking at COVID-19, that just highlights that. So currently we have, with COVID-19, there's 1 out of 7 Canadians who are experiencing food insecurity. And prior to the pandemic, 4.5 million Canadians were food insecure. And that essentially means they didn't have adequate income to purchase healthy, nutritious food, or were consistently worried about having enough food to eat. And those numbers since the pandemic have skyrocketed by 39%. And we see those communities who are most affected, once again, facing multiple barriers as a result of the impacts of closures and other restrictions that have come from the pandemic. So, here in Canada, and many of the folks I work with, it is very clear there is one key solution to begin to address the experience of food insecurity by these groups and by most people who are food insecure, and that is to address the issue of income. Income is going to have the most, benefit to these people to ensure that they have the means and the dignity to be able to identify which food they'd like to eat and where they'd like to purchase it and under what terms. And so I think when we look at COVID-19, we see a huge cut to huge job losses across the board. And we see that those job losses are also not felt equally. So, if we look as groups for, specifically looking at what jobs are being cut, we're looking at service jobs, frontline worker jobs, and those jobs are often precarious and low income. So, and also with a high representation of these same groups who are experiencing food insecurity. So we're seeing an intensified impact. In addition to that, when we're looking at single parent households, who now we have parents trying to juggle whether they're able to actually continue their work, or they have to actually work less hours or work longer days, having a particular impact on household food insecurity more generally. Similarly, when we look at the impacts on grocery stores, and we have folks who are working multiple jobs, and in addition to not only thinking about being able to go to the grocery store and wait an extra hour in line to be able to access food, folks who are working longer hours aren't able to do that. And by the time they get into the grocery store with depleted stocks, are not able to purchase food in bulk. So we're seeing a huge range of different experiences of inequity to be able to access adequate food and not having the means to do so. I think we can also think about who is forced to continue to work in these essential jobs, not experiencing any increase in pay, but being put at an additional risk. to be able to provide, Canadians with healthy food and also with the services that they're used to accessing. And once again, we see a disproportionate risk for those workers and a higher proportion of those workers being racialized as well, including likely what Janet and Gabriel will speak to with migrant workers. So I think we're seeing how these rates are particularly impacting these populations. And now when we look at who is also experiencing the brunt of COVID-19, which we've seen skyrocketing rates of folks who are Black in Canada, with 83% of the COVID cases here in Canada being represented by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, despite in Canada only representing 9% of the population. We start to really understand that this is a structural systemic racism issue and how people are not only experiencing the food system, but the interlocking systems to support them. And so how this has shifted my particular work is really about having the tool and the evidence to be able to highlight where these real challenges are and the root causes to be able to reframe what our solutions look like. So we've heard a lot of conversation about basic income being a key tool. And I think that's a piece of the puzzle, but unless we reroute our systems and our programmatic approaches with an anti-racism lens, basic income will not be enough. We will not have people accessing healthcare services and receive the treatment that they need because those services will already discriminate against their experience. And we see that clearly in not only the number of people who died from COVID who identify as Black or Indigenous or racialized, but we also see that in the other interactions with service providers that limit their ability to safely access services, whether that be at food banks or other support services. So similarly, I think in this moment, what it has shown me is the importance of community-based responses. So in this moment, we have seen a huge, honoring or uplifting of community-based responses to address communities who are in need. Here in Toronto, where I work, we've seen Black communities come together and have the relationships with vulnerable communities to be able to work with them to provide immediate food response. And unfortunately, in the initial responses by the municipalities, they were completely shut out of those responses. So, not being at the decision-making table when thinking about how, who's in need and how to deliver those services. And so in this moment, really focusing on how community gardens can be an opportunity for a key place where people are actually growing and accessing their own food that's affordable and culturally appropriate to meet those needs, but also to think about COVID-19 really showing the limits of our current supply chain system and how that supply chain is actually undermining our ability to access food in a more sustainable way. We are, the 5th largest exporter of agriculture in the world, and we're also the 5th largest importer. So we're missing a huge opportunity to actually supply food in our city region systems and connect rural and urban needs. And that goes also for the experiences of how local farmers actually are able to support and be part of the solution to provide healthy, fresh, affordable food in communities. So thinking about how to have more interconnected systems and ensuring that the right folks are around the table to actually reframe what solutions look like, to be able to start to address not just food insecurity, not just the disproportionate impact and racialization of food insecurity, but also start to address the biodiversity and sustainability challenges that we are facing here in Canada. And, just to answer a bit of the last question of so where do we go from here? How do we build these systems together? I think I would call on everyone on this panel to think about 2 things. One, being really thinking about who is at your leadership table, who is making decisions with you, and how can you not only include and create space for diverse voices, whether they be migrant workers, whether they be farmers of color, whether they be Indigenous peoples who are the rightful owners of the land, but actually think about how you cultivate and support and invest in their leadership at your table and their distinct leadership at their own tables, because it's that alternative approach and diversity that's going to give us the tools we need to reimagine a new food system that works for everyone. The second thing I would say is thinking about how can we use a more intersectional lens to do this work. One thing that I constantly come up against is, this is the racial justice movement, this is the food movement, the food justice movement, this is the climate justice and the gender justice, and and the decent work movement, when in fact these are all the same movement. And if we start to use an intersectional lens to approach these challenges, we'll start to get at the root causes. I think this moment right now where we're seeing a sea of climate change impacting folks, if we recognize that people who are disproportionately impacted by climate change are racialized, we start to see the connection between racism and climate justice. We start to see the solutions as not mutually exclusive, but as interconnected. And we start to reimagine how we approach these things to create a food system that works for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Melana. Those were very inspiring words. And I appreciate your perspective on all of these important issues. And Stephanie, I think that gives you a lot of to talk about from the perspective of the United States as well, and what COVID has done to change your view of the food system and how you see things going forward. So over to you. Thanks.
Many, many snaps, Melana. That is all right where we are right now. Thank you so much. To build off of that, because I don't need to repeat any of those amazing truths. The one thing I'll share about COVID is the experience of walking into any grocery store and seeing everything missing off the shelves, and seeing a bunch of white people wheeling out with their carts heaped full of food and toilet paper. The feeling of seeing this hoarding was terrifying to me. It was like just the canary in the coal mine to me. It was terrifying to see people running and hoarding their food. I remember actually going in to a Whole Foods a few years back and trying to buy just one red pepper for I normally don't actually shop at Whole Foods because I can't afford the food there, but trying to buy one red pepper for I was missing something for a recipe, and went to the checkout, and it was $7 for one red pepper. And it made me think of this similar wealth hoarding. It went right back to this idea of hoarding wealth. And what it made me realize is that not only are folks hoarding wealth, but they're hoarding the power. And, just thinking about, the large cafeterias and chain restaurants that were shut in the early days of COVID, it really made our, these giant food and beverage corporations, they reduced all their purchases and were hoarding around that wealth, because everything was stopping, that they reduced all their purchases, not from the large agribusinesses who can't afford that, but from the small, or they can't afford that, but the small and mid-scale farmers, the local farmers. And many farmers, including our farmers of color, they invested labor and resources into growing that food that is so much more precious than the industrialized agribusiness that we see, who was competing for federal relief at that time. So we were seeing those giant dumps of food that could have actually gone somewhere and fed people during this time. But instead of that, they just dumped it and got rid of it. And we saw images of people like scaling mountains of potatoes and gleaning things. And it was just terrifying. The more connected we are to people and places that grow our food, the more food secure we will be. Local farmers and small businesses who are part of those shorter, smaller supply chains are more likely and better able to make decisions that are better for all of us. We need to make it possible for independent farmers, ranchers, fishers, and all sorts of folks producing food to earn a living while continuing to provide us with the nutritious, sustainable food that they grow. One example would be in New York State. We do a lot of work in New York, and this is something that is across the board in a lot of the Northeast, but the average income for a Black farmer in New York State is negative $906 for a primary producer. The average income for a white farmer in New York State is $42,000. So let that sink in for a minute and think about how that affects things as far as like how you support your families, how much time you can invest in your farm, and who you can hire and pay. Together, we have to urge politicians, we have to invest in independent, small, medium-scale farmers, fishers, ranchers, regional food production, processing, and distribution. We have to connect farmers to direct markets like farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, and community-supported food assistance programs as well. A great example would be in Buffalo during, I think it was Buffalo, yeah. during the height of the pandemic, the African Food Co-op, I believe in Buffalo, actually connected SNAP assistance payments directly. Oh, it was Lexington Co-op, I think, but SNAP assistance payments directly to the co-op. So not only connecting folks to food, but not dead food, right? Food that is going to infuse us with life, and food that's nourishing and healthy and whole. We have to demand policies that support independent producers. Agriculture is deeply, deeply industrialized. The average size of a farm 40 years ago was about 150 acres. Those small family farms have actually grown and expanded and been consumed and hoarded. That land has been hoarded by large agribusiness. And now the average size of a farm in the States, at least, is 400 acres average. That's unmanageable. And they're being managed by machines. They're being managed, they're being managed by machines, and they're being managed by like the migrant farm workers who have absolutely no rights. And you're right to say that these farm workers are living in really, really, really poor environments that are crowding them. And we can see that in the results, like we saw the Windsor, Ontario outbreak of the pandemic, and there were maybe upwards of 25 farm workers infected with COVID. They're living in environments that they're all breathing the same air. They have no way to keep distance from themselves. So just thinking about that and urging our politicians and urging our folks who are invested in policy to be able and becoming part of that movement in policy to advance policy that really supports medium and small scale farmers, especially Black, Indigenous, POC farmers who work not only on a smaller scale, but in a more regenerative scale. So really looking at things that will build a more resilient soil structure that will, like you were saying, Melana, it's all interconnected, it's all intersectional. The land justice, earth justice, gender justice, racial justice is all based in the same thing, which is a hoarding of power and resources for one specific demographic.
Stephanie, thank you so much for those words and providing, adding to the perspectives that we've heard so far around COVID and what we can do moving forward. We're already at time, but I'd really like to continue this conversation. Gabriel, if you don't mind, I just need to let people know that this will be available on our YouTube page and that all registrants will be given a link via a follow-up email. So if you have to leave right now because of time, you can look at this once you have the time to do that. But now, if it's okay, Gabriel, I don't want to impose on your time, and also our panelists. Are you all able to stay with us for a few, maybe another 10 minutes? We've only had the comments about how inspiring your work is and some suggestions about ways forward, but we haven't got any questions so far. So maybe we'll just give Gabriel and Janet the chance for a few words, and then ask all of you for maybe 2 or 3 sentences to wrap up, and then we'll be done for today. Are you all okay to stay on for another 10 or 15 minutes? Yeah? Okay, thank you so much. Gabriel.
Thank you. 2 things quickly in the interest of time. 2 things. One, COVID has done, what it has done, it has highlighted the significance of migrant workers. Now we are deemed essential, but yet still we are not being treated fairly. One example is we do not get hazard pay. That's just simple one example. What I'm happy about, would you believe if I tell you I'm happy for COVID? Ironical, right? What COVID has done, the work that we do, it is generally invisible. COVID has placed us right front and center. So COVID has really helped us with our work. So really, we are at the stage, we've never found ourselves in such a strong position to pressure the politicians and also to rally the public into pressuring politicians to bring a fair and just system. In that same vein, I would like to say, a migrant worker is like an egg sandwich. We find ourselves in the middle. We are like in the middle. In our home countries, unemployment is high. Come to Canada, we face difficult conditions. But to you, the participants, I want you to see the situation as an egg. Going forward, I want you to see it's only our hands are needed in Canada. But in your hands, there's power in your hands as a consumer, as a voter, as a student, as a human being, there's power in your hands. I'm asking you that question in closing. The things that you're going to do today, are you going to use those things that you're going to do? Are you going to create the conditions that will break that egg from the outside? Or are you going to create the conditions that will cause that egg to break from the inside and create a just society in Canada? That's how I would like to close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Janet.
Well, migrant workers have been deeply affected by COVID-19, as several people have already mentioned. There's been some 1,500 workers now infected. Some members of our migrant worker expert working group have estimated that they have experienced an infection rate of approximately 10%, which is much greater than the general public and even greater than those in other high-risk professions like healthcare. Now, why are migrant workers so vulnerable? Some people have mentioned the obvious, overcrowded living conditions, which do not allow for physical distancing. Now, as Gabriel just mentioned, we've known about this, those of us who live and work in these or research these circumstances for many years. But what COVID has done is shone a light on these living conditions, which are in many cases are quite inhumane. In the situation of COVID, if you're sharing living quarters, common bathrooms, kitchens, bedrooms, and one person is infected, it can easily spread like wildfire, and that's exactly what has happened. Now, I rushed through my first answer, but I don't want to rush through this one because I want to share with you a little bit about the 3 workers who have tragically died of COVID this season. I want you to know their names. I want you to know the circumstances of their death, because I do believe that these stories shed light on the greater realities. So the first to die of COVID was Bonifacio Eugenio Romero at just 31 years old. Bonifacio came to work on a pepper farm in Kingsville, where he developed symptoms of COVID and was sent to self-isolate in a hotel. While there, his situation deteriorated and he called emergency services from his room in distress. Within 30 minutes, he died. His final moments were spent alone. He had no previous health conditions, and again, he was just 31 years old. Now, for me, questions remain over whether he would have survived if he had been able to access medical care earlier in his illness. Again, just thinking about the stark contrast of his experience with that of the well-publicized journey of Donald Trump, who was monitored from the get-go, given cutting-edge treatments, and flown by helicopter to a private luxury medical facility at the earliest sign of concern. This contrast for me really underscores the grave injustices between those who are deemed worthy of life at any expense and those who are effectively left to die alone. Surely here in Ontario, we could have done better to monitor and protect workers like Bonifacio, and he should not have died this way. Like Bonifacio, Juan Lopez Chaparro came to Canada to support his family. He was a loving husband and father of 4 who died after over 200 workers were infected with COVID at his place of employment, Scotland Group. He had been coming to Canada for a decade and was most recently employed cultivating corn, asparagus, watermelon, and ginseng. The bunkhouses at his farm, some of them held about 70 workers per unit. And according to reports, he didn't have consistent access to an interpreter at the hospital. It's unclear if he understood what was happening or was able to say goodbye to his family before being put on a ventilator. He died at the age of 55. Finally, I want to talk to you about the situation of Rogelio Munoz Santos. So in addition to legally employed temporary foreign workers that Gabriel has talked about who've come on migrant worker programs, we need to also remember that there are thousands of migrant workers without legal authorization who are in some cases even more precarious. And Rogelio was one such worker. He arrived in Canada on a tourist visa and did not have legal authorization to work. Labor advocates are concerned that his situation may have shown signs of human trafficking for the purposes of labor exploitation. His co-workers reported that they came to Canada with the promise of legal work by a recruiter, but were misled and then had to work off their recruitment fees at an agricultural operation. They were placed in overcrowded housing and not provided with information about how to protect themselves from COVID or equipment to do so. Now, many workers in these types of situations are reluctant to seek medical care or other services and supports for fear of deportation. Rogelio became very sick and he did eventually seek medical care, but unfortunately it was not enough. He was just 24 years old when he died of COVID. Each of these men was from Mexico. Each were employed here in Ontario. Each of them leaves behind mourning families, parents, children, and spouses who have not only lost their breadwinners, but also their loved ones. I've been so disheartened to see these families pleading for help through GoFundMe campaigns to pay for their loved ones' funeral expenses. So, returning to your question about how the COVID pandemic has changed the way I think about the food system or the focus of my work. Well, to be quite honest, I cannot eat anymore without thinking of the incredible sacrifices these frontline workers have made, even more so than my awareness before. I feel heartbroken knowing that these families have lost their loved ones. I feel angry because I know we should have done more to protect and care for them. And this has motivated me to become more focused on raising awareness and writing recommendations to hopefully improve the health and safety of migrant workers into the future. This is why some of my colleagues and I formed the Migrant Worker Health Expert Working Group. We're a group of scholars and clinicians from across Canada who have come together to raise awareness about the vulnerabilities migrant workers face and to make evidence-based recommendations to all levels of government to improve their health and safety. No more workers should unnecessarily be placed in positions of peril. They deserve full rights and protections. And we all need to take some responsibility for ensuring that these workers are better protected and also that their families are adequately supported when things do go wrong. Right now, this is not the case, and we still have a lot of work to do. We need to start by recognizing, appreciating, and valuing the tremendous contributions of migrant workers in our food system, rather than erasing their presence. We need to do this symbolically. For example, in advertising campaigns celebrating our local harvests at this time of year, which we've all seen, these tend to only feature white Canadian farmers. We should be including at the foreground the faces of migrant workers. We also have to do this structurally by changing the policies that govern migrant worker programs to ensure that conditions of work are just, that living conditions are safe, that workers can access their rights without coercion, that they can change employers freely if they wish, that they are included fully in all labor standards and protections, and that they can become permanent residents if they choose. All the things that Gabriel has highlighted. And we need to listen to migrant workers like Gabriel to better understand their experiences and what we can do to improve things. Politicians are able to ignore these issues if they think that the electorate is not paying attention, if they think that we don't care. So it's incumbent upon all of us who have the power of voting to let our representatives know that migrant workers matter and to demand better treatment. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Again, more compelling and inspiring words to encourage people to break the silence and bring about structural change that everybody's been calling for and is so needed. I think we have enough time now for everybody to have about a minute of wrap-up comments, if you would like to do that. Melana, if we started with you and then we just went with the order that we had before. I see that you've, are you able to join us again? Okay, would you like to have, make some closing comments?
Sure, thank you. And thanks everyone for your comments. I will keep it short and just leave it with, I guess, 2 reflections. So the first being on space. I think it's a real honor to sit with the folks I've been listening to and consider what it means to have space in Canada, visibility, dignity, access to land, access to resources, to be supported, and you know, whose presence is facilitated in our land and on our space, and who's safe, and whose representation is welcomed and whose is silenced. And so I wanted to share a quote to reflect on that and all of our roles in this work. So the quote is from Frantz Fanon, and it says that for a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and, above all, dignity. And I share that because I think it's important for us all to come back to this conversation around land. I think we've spent a lot of time talking about people, and I think relationships are the first and some of the most important things that we all treasure in our lives. And this moment of a pandemic and climate helps us remember that. But I don't think we can forget the land and the environment and our role in shaping that and the connections between the two. So the last comment I will share with you is about how we continue to cultivate those relationships. And it's a quote that says, "If you walk in front of me, I will not follow. If you walk behind me, I will not lead. If you walk beside me, we will move forward together." And I think this is an important reflection to think about the things that we heard in the calls to action about how we move forward in relation with each other and with regenerative work and practice. And just to remind everyone that, you know, movements aren't driven by charismatic individuals. We've heard some incredible speakers. Movements are the result of countless people working together for a shared vision of the future. And I am hopeful that after this talk, you will be inspired to do just that. Come together with a group of people and move forward in the interest of addressing the many challenges we're facing in our food system and in our shared future. Thank you.
Thank you for your inspiring words, Melana, and those of other people. Very much appreciated. Stephanie, would you like to share some closing comments?
Thank you. Yes, climate chaos and this pandemic have shown us all that we need crisis-proof food systems to feed us now and in the years to come. Throughout history, politicians have taken away Indigenous land and water rights, disenfranchised Black communities, prevented immigrants from owning farmland, and confiscated land from farmers of color. Government officials have also denied loans and other financial assistance to farmers of color, especially Black Indigenous farmers, and relegated a majority of Latinx farm workforce to a disempowered class. As a result, most BIPOC farmers struggle to remain farmers and hold on to their land, and they grow their operations at a much slower pace than their white contemporaries. We all benefit from the leadership of producers who are Black, Indigenous, and POC, whose knowledge in traditional farming techniques and ancestral foodways have proved resilient in the face of displacement and climate chaos. By investing in BIPOC producers, we can continue to build adaptive and resilient food supply chains and strong regional economies rooted in real relationships. We need to transition land and resources to BIPOC producers, including in the form of reparations. We must ensure that decision makers defund police and redirect those funds to nurturing physical, economic, and social well-being in communities across the country. And I'll just end with another inspiring quote that really kind of uplifts what Melana was just saying, which is a quote that I feel is really rooted in the same spirit, which is, if you've come to help me, you are wasting your time. If you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. That's Aboriginal elder Lila Watson that mentioned that. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for participating. I've learned so much from all of you, and I'm grateful for all of your time. You're clearly all very busy people, and it's a privilege to have you all together in the same space. Gabriel, did you have some closing remarks that you'd like to share?
Yes, please. As we all know, today is World Food Day, and there are two teachings. Some people see the world as a loan from our children, and when we hand it back to our kids, that's a better place. But other people see the world as a place to grab and exploit, and that's what we're fighting. And all of y'all should be familiar with this if you're from Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They call it, because of the injustices that Indigenous people face, there are 94 calls to action. 94, not 2, not 10, not 20, 94 calls to action. That is the depth of injustices in Canada. And I'm telling you that the farm program is unjust. Basically, migrant workers are being milked. And I'm calling on you right now to use the power in your hands. We call it for status upon arrival, and that is not something new. This is something that Canada granted to Europeans, and the moment that people of color like me came here, that they decided to close the door. We asked in Canada to turn all the way 360 what they've done for people of European descent, that they can do it to migrant workers. And as I said, having status, it takes care of both our vulnerabilities, both immigration and labor vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel, so much. Janet, did you have any closing remarks?
Just a big ditto to everything that's been said. I really want to thank you and my fellow panelists for everyone's really insightful reflections. On a personal note, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and saddened with all of the problems in the world. And this can lead us to inaction, but having the opportunity to dialogue with all of you and listen just makes me realize that we don't have time to be complacent and that there are many people working very hard to create a more just food system. And I hope we can continue to work together to make that a reality.
Those are excellent words. I really have, you've all contributed so much knowledge and wisdom and thinking to this important issue. And I'm really grateful we all are at the UNESCO Chair for all of your time and thoughts and your life experience that have brought you to the place where you can share all this with us. So thank you so much. And we look forward to more conversations, and thank you as well to our participants, 41 of whom stuck with us to this point. So I wish you all a good World Food Day, and that we have had a chance to share these thoughts together is really, I think this is the most impactful World Food Day I've ever experienced. So thank you for that. And be well, everybody.